This is HOA outplayed. She brought a ruler and a grudge. I am standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning with frost on my beard and a woman screaming 6 inches from my face that I installed a plow stake wrong and she can find me daily until the snow melts and I cry. Her name is Betty Lewis. She is the Welcome Committee Chair for Summit Snowfield HOA Incorporated. She is holding a small metal scraper like it is a judge's gavel and pointing it at a bent orange fiberglass stake half buried in the snowbank. The stake is not mine. The HOA plow knocked it over 2 days ago. I know because I watched it happen from my kitchen window while I was making coffee before my shift. I work for the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan as a public works field crew lead, which means I know exactly what is public right-of-way and what is private property. This stake is city property. Betty does not care. She says, "You can be mad or you can be compliant. The choice is always yours." I moved here 6 months ago because the rent was decent and the neighborhood looked quiet. My wife and I needed a fresh start after her surgery bills piled up, and we had to choose between staying near family or staying solvent. We chose solvent. Summit Snowfield is one of those places where normal life becomes an enforcement opportunity. Every driveway is watched, every snowbank is measured, every ice patch is cataloged. The HOA runs like a private police force with a budget that comes from our pockets and no accountability to anyone but themselves. Betty Lewis is the face of that machine. She has gray hair pulled into a bun, a gray belted wool coat, and a white knit hat that makes her look like she is about to conduct an inspection at a military base. She wears a lanyard with a blank HOA badge that has no readable text, but she flashes it like it is federal ID. She is saying something about emergency snow protocols and compliance windows and mandatory inspections. I am trying to tell her the stake is not mine. She cuts me off and says if I argue, she will add insubordination to the violation report. I ask what violation. She taps the scraper against the stake and says improper installation of winter markers in the common easement zone. I tell her it is a city stake in the public right-of-way. She says the HOA easement extends to the curb. I tell her Michigan law says the right-of-way is public up to the sidewalk. She says the HOA covenants supersede state statutes. I tell her that is not how laws work. She smiles and says, "You can be mad, or you can be compliant." I am already late for work. My crew is waiting at the yard to load the salt spreaders, and I am stuck here explaining property lines to someone who thinks an HOA covenant is the Constitution. I tell her I need to leave. She steps in front of my truck. I tell her to move. She says she is conducting an official inspection, and I cannot leave until she is finished. I ask if she is detaining me. She says she is enforcing community standards. I pull out my phone and start recording. She does not flinch. She says recording without consent is harassment and she will file a complaint. I tell her Michigan is a one-party consent state and I am the one party. She taps the scraper against my bumper and says she is noting refusal to cooperate in the violation log. This is how it starts. A bent stake. A woman with a scraper. A threat that sounds absurd until you realize she means every word. Betty finally steps aside, but she tells me this is not over. She says a formal notice will be delivered by end of business today. I ask what the fine is. She says the initial penalty is $250 with $50 added daily until compliance is achieved. I tell her again the stake is not mine. She says ignorance is not a defense. I get in my truck and leave. My hands are shaking on the wheel, not from cold, from the feeling that I just walked into a trap I did not see coming. At work, I tell my supervisor what happened. He laughs and says HOAs are their own little kingdoms and you cannot fight City Hall even when City Hall is a condo clubhouse. I tell him I am not paying a fine for something I did not do. He says good luck with that and hands me the route sheet. We spend the morning salting overpasses and clearing storm drains. The whole time I am thinking about Betty and her scraper and the way she smiled when she said daily fines. I check my phone at lunch. There is an email from the Summit Snowfield HOA portal. Subject line: Violation notice, immediate action required. I open it. The notice says I failed to remove a hazardous winter marker from the common easement zone within the 48-hour compliance window. The fine is $250. Payment is due within 7 days or the amount increases to $500. There is a photo attached. It is the bent steak. The photo is timestamped this morning at 7:15, 3 minutes after I left. I call the HOA office. I get voicemail. I leave a message explaining the steak is city property and I did not install it. I ask for a hearing. I get an automated reply that says all appeals must be submitted through the portal within 72 hours or the violation becomes final. I log into the portal to file the appeal. The portal is down. The error message says maintenance in progress, try again later. I try again at the end of my shift. Still down. I call the office again. Voicemail again. I send an email directly to the board. No reply. 2 days later, I get a second notice. Subject line: final warning. Compliance overdue. The fine is now $500. The notice says I failed to respond to the initial violation and my appeal window has closed. I reply immediately and attach screenshots showing the portal was down. I include a copy of my original voicemail timestamp. I explain again that the steak is city property. I get an automated reply that says all communications must go through the portal. The portal is still down. On the third day, a man in a green vest shows up at my door. He says he is with a vendor contracted by the HOA to verify snow compliance and provoke a reaction. Those are his exact words. Verify compliance and provoke a reaction. I ask what that means. He says he is supposed to take photos of my property and note any violations. I ask if he works for Betty. He says he works for the HOA. I tell him the HOA hired him to harass me. He shrugs and says he is just doing his job. He walks around my driveway with a clipboard and takes photos of my mailbox, my trash cans, the snowbank along my fence, and the sidewalk in front of my house. He knocks on my door again and says I have an ice patch near my front steps that constitutes a slip hazard. I go outside and look. There is no ice patch. The steps are clear. He points at a wet spot where the sun melted some frost. He says that could refreeze and become black ice. I tell him it is 10 degrees and sunny and nothing is refreezing. He writes something on the clipboard and leaves. The next morning I get a third notice. Subject line: emergency safety violation, immediate payment required. The notice says I created a slip hazard in a common area and failed to remediate within the emergency response window. The fine is $1,000. Payment is due immediately, or the amount increases by $100 per day. The notice also says the HOA is authorized to contract emergency remediation services and charge me for the cost. I call the office. Voicemail. I email the board. No reply. I try the portal. Still down. I am paying for my wife's follow-up appointments and medication out of pocket because our insurance has a high deductible and we have not hit it yet. Every bogus fine from this HOA is money we do not have. I tell my wife what is happening. She says we should just pay the fine and move on. I tell her I am not paying for something I did not do. She says fighting it will cost more in the long run. I tell her I cannot let them get away with this. She says we cannot afford a lawyer. I tell her I do not need a lawyer. I need proof. I start documenting everything. I take photos of the steak every morning. I measure the distance from my property line to the curb. I print copies of the Michigan right-of-way statutes. I record every interaction with Betty. I keep a log of every portal outage. I save every email. I talk to my neighbor, a man named Carl who rents his townhouse and works as a renter advocate for a nonprofit downtown. He says HOAs pull this stuff all the time and most people just pay because fighting it is exhausting. He says the key is to make them follow their own rules and document every time they do not. He says he will help me file a complaint if it comes to that. On day 5, Betty shows up again. This time she has a man with her. He is wearing a white hard hat and an orange safety vest. Betty says he is a contractor hired to assess the damage I caused to common property. I ask what damage. She points at the curb near the bent stake. She says my improper snow removal damaged the curb face and I must pay for repair immediately or face daily compounding fees. I look at the curb. There is a small chip in the concrete about the size of a dime. It is old. There is dirt and grass growing in the crack. I tell her the chip was already there. She says I have no proof. I pull out my phone and show her a photo I took the day I moved in. The chip is clearly visible. She looks at the photo and says the photo does not prove when it was taken. I show her the metadata timestamp. She says metadata can be faked. I tell her she is making this up. She says, You can be mad, or you can be compliant. The contractor writes something on a form and hands it to Betty. She hands it to me. It is an invoice. No readable text, but she says it is for $800. She says payment is due within 24 hours or the HOA will place a lien on my property. I let her say my name loud, because later I wanted it on the recording. She says, "Mr. Thompson, you are in violation of multiple covenants, and you are running out of time. I suggest you comply before this gets worse." I say, "Worse how?" She smiles and taps the scraper against her palm. She says, "I can fine you daily until the snow melts and you cry." That night, I cannot sleep. I keep thinking about the invoice and the lien threat and the way Betty smiled. My wife says maybe we should just pay and cut our losses. I tell her paying will not stop this. Betty is running a shakedown. She is targeting me because I pushed back. If I pay now, she will know I fold under pressure, and she will come back for more. My wife says we cannot afford to fight. I tell her we cannot afford not to. The next morning I get a call from a towing company. The dispatcher says they have an authorization to tow my truck from the Summit Snowfield common parking area. I tell her my truck is in my driveway, not the parking area. She says the work order says common area parking violation. I ask who authorized it. She says the HOA. I ask for a name. She says Betty Lewis. I tell her Betty does not have authority to authorize a tow from my private driveway. The dispatcher pauses and says the work order says common area. I tell her to send me a copy of the authorization. She says she will email it. I give her my address. 20 minutes later, I get the email. The authorization form has Betty's signature and a checkbox marked common area violation. There is a note in the margin that says repeated non-compliance, emergency removal required. The form lists my truck make and model and license plate. I forward the email to Carl and ask if this is legal. He calls me back within 5 minutes. He says if the truck is on private property and the HOA does not own the property, the tow is not legal. He says I should file a police report for attempted unauthorized tow. He says if the truck gets towed anyway, I should call the police immediately and document everything. I go outside to check on my truck. It is still in my driveway. I move it to the street in front of my house, which is public parking. I take photos showing the truck on the street with the house number visible in frame. I text the photos to Carl. He says good move. At work, my supervisor asks how the HOA thing is going. I tell him it is getting worse. He says HOAs are like bad exes, they never let go. I tell him I think Betty is running some kind of scam. He says most HOA board members are volunteers with too much time and not enough oversight, which is a recipe for petty tyranny. I tell him it feels bigger than petty. He shrugs and says if I think something illegal is happening, I should talk to a lawyer. I tell him I cannot afford a lawyer. He says then I better hope I am wrong. That afternoon, I get an email from the HOA. Subject line, lien notice, payment overdue. The email says I owe $3,150 in fines, penalties, and emergency service fees. The total includes the original stake violation, the ice hazard violation, the curb damage invoice, late fees, administrative fees, and interest compounding daily. The email says if I do not pay within 48 hours, the HOA will file a lien against my property. I print the email and take it to Carl. He reads it and whistles. He says $3,000 in 6 days is aggressive even for a bad HOA. He says something is wrong. He asks if I have records of all the notices. I show him my folder. He flips through the pages and stops at the tow authorization. He says this is the smoking gun. He says the tow company logs every dispatch and records every call. He says if Betty authorized a tow without proper authority, that is fraud. He says I should file a complaint with the management company that oversees the HOA. I ask if there is a management company. He says every HOA in Michigan has to have a registered agent. He looks up Summit Snowfield on the state website and finds the management company name and contact info. He says I should send them everything I have and request an audit. I draft an email to the management company. I attach the portal outage screenshots, the tow authorization, the lien notice, the photos of the stake and the curb, and the voicemail timestamps. I explain that Betty is selectively enforcing rules, fabricating violations, and threatening illegal actions. I request a formal hearing and an independent audit of the winter enforcement program. I hit send. I get an automated reply that says my message has been received and someone will respond within 5 business days. If this story has you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe, because the payback is coming and you do not want to miss it. I do not have 5 business days. My home insurance carrier is requesting photos of the property for a routine policy review, and I have to respond within a short window or risk a coverage lapse. I cannot afford a lapse. I take the photos and upload them to the insurance portal. 2 hours later, I get a call from the insurance company. The rep says there is a notation on my account about a pending lien. She asks if I am aware of it. I tell her yes, and it is bogus. She says liens affect insurability, and I need to resolve it or my premium will increase. I tell her I am fighting it. She says she understands, but the notation stays until the lien is resolved or withdrawn. She says my renewal is in 4 weeks, and if the lien is still active, my rate will go up by 30%. I hang up and punch the wall. That night there is a knock on my door. It is Betty. She is holding the small metal scraper and a manila envelope. She says she is here to deliver a final courtesy notice. I tell her to leave. She says I can accept the notice, or she can post it on my door and take a photo for the record. I open the door. She hands me the envelope. It is wet at the corners from snow. She says the envelope contains a hearing notice. I ask when the hearing is. She says tomorrow night at 7. I tell her that is not enough notice. She says the covenants allow emergency hearings with 24-hour notice when there is a safety issue. I tell her there is no safety issue. She says the board disagrees. She turns to leave and then stops. She says, "You can still pay and make this go away." I tell her I am not paying. She says, "Then I will see you at the hearing. You can be mad, or you can be compliant." I call Carl. He says 24 hours is not enough time to prepare. He says I should request a continuance. I tell him Betty will deny it. He says request it anyway and document that she denied it. He says that shows bias. He asks if I have a trump card. I tell him I might. He says I better play it at the hearing or I am going to lose. The next morning I go to the city public works office and pull the maintenance logs for the plow routes in my neighborhood. The logs show the city plow hit an orange fiberglass stake on my street 2 days before Betty showed up. The log notes the stake was bent but not removed because it was still standing. The driver's name is on the log. I make copies. I also pull the right-of-way maps for my address. The maps show the city easement extends to the curb, which means the stake was in city jurisdiction, not HOA jurisdiction. I make copies of the maps too. I put everything in a folder. At lunch I meet Carl at a coffee shop. He brings a woman named Donna, who is a paralegal for a nonprofit that fights housing discrimination. Carl says Donna has dealt with abusive HOAs before. Donna looks at my folder and says this is a textbook case of selective enforcement. She says the tow authorization is the key because it shows intent to harass. She says if I can prove Betty has a pattern of targeting certain homeowners while ignoring violations by others, I can argue discrimination. I tell her I do not know if she targets others. Donna says we can find out. She says HOA meeting minutes are public record in Michigan. She says if the minutes show Betty enforcing rules against some people but not others, that is evidence. Carl says he can pull the minutes tonight. I thank them both. That afternoon I get a text from an unknown number. The text says, "Stop fighting or it gets worse." I screenshot it and send it to Carl. He says save everything. At 6:30 I drive to the HOA clubhouse for the hearing. The hearing is supposed to be at 7, but Betty told me to meet her outside at 6:45. I park and walk to the clubhouse entrance. Betty is standing on the exterior steps with 2 other board members. One is a man in his 60s wearing a puffy black coat. The other is a woman in her 50s wearing a red parka. Betty introduces them as the board president and the treasurer. She does not give their names. The president says they are here to conduct a preliminary compliance check before the hearing. I ask what that means. He says they want to inspect my documentation. I tell him I will present it at the hearing. He says they need to see it now to determine if the hearing is even necessary. Betty smiles. I realize this is another trap. If I show them my evidence now, they will have time to prepare a counter. If I refuse, they will claim I am uncooperative. I say, I will present my evidence at the hearing in front of witnesses. Betty says, then we will note your refusal to cooperate. I say, note whatever you want. The president says the hearing starts in 10 minutes and I should go inside and wait. I walk past them and go into the clubhouse. The main room is set up with a folding table at the front and rows of folding chairs facing it. There are about a dozen people sitting in the chairs. I recognize some of them as neighbors. Carl is sitting in the back row. He waves. I sit next to him. He whispers that he pulled the meeting minutes and found something big. He hands me a printed packet. I flip through it. The minutes show Betty has filed 23 violation notices in the past 6 months. All 23 are against the same 5 homeowners. None of the 5 are on the board. Carl has highlighted a section where Betty proposed a new winter safety committee and the board approved it unanimously. The committee has 1 member, Betty. The board members walk in and sit at the front table. Betty sits in the middle, the president sits on her left, the treasurer sits on her right. Betty bangs a gavel on the table and says the hearing is now in session. She says the purpose of the hearing is to review violations filed against me and determine penalties. She says I have 5 minutes to present my defense. I stand up and walk to the front. I put my folder on the table. I say I am here to dispute 4 violation notices that are all based on false claims. I open the folder and pull out the plow logs. I explain that the stake Betty cited me for was city property knocked over by a city plow. I show the logs. Betty says the logs are irrelevant because the stake was in the HOA easement. I pull out the right-of-way maps. I show that the easement does not extend past the curb. Betty says the maps are outdated. I point to the date on the maps. They are from this year. The president clears his throat and says the board will take the maps under advisement. I pull out the portal outage screenshots. I explain that I tried to file an appeal within the 72-hour window, but the portal was down. I show the error messages. Betty says portal maintenance is not an excuse for missing deadlines. I pull out the email I sent directly to the board during the outage. I show the automated reply that said all communications must go through the portal. I ask how I was supposed to appeal if the portal was down and direct emails were rejected. The treasurer shifts in her seat. The president says the board will take that under advisement too. I pull out the tow authorization. I explain that Betty authorized a tow from my private driveway without legal authority. I read the dispatcher's email out loud. I point out that the tow company questioned the authorization and asked for clarification. I say that if the tow had gone through, it would have been theft. Betty's face goes red. She says the tow was authorized under emergency safety protocols. I ask what emergency. She says repeated non-compliance. I ask her to cite the specific covenant that allows the HOA to tow a vehicle from a private driveway without the owner's consent. She does not answer. The president says the board will review the tow authorization and issue a written decision. Carl stands up in the back row. He says he has additional evidence. Betty bangs the gavel and says only the homeowner may present evidence. Carl says he is a witness and witnesses are allowed under the bylaws. The president nods. Carl walks to the front and hands me the printed minutes. I flip to the highlighted section and read it out loud. I say Betty has filed 23 violations in 6 months, and all of them are against 5 homeowners. I ask if the board thinks that is random or selective. The treasurer looks at Betty. Betty says the 5 homeowners are chronic violators. I ask for documentation of previous violations. Betty says the records are in storage. I ask when they will be available. She says that is not relevant to this hearing. I say it is absolutely relevant because it goes to bias and selective enforcement. The president says the board will review the minutes and issue a written decision. I take a breath. This is the moment. I pull out the last document in my folder. It is a printed spreadsheet. I say I obtained vendor payment records from the management company under Michigan's HOA transparency law. I slide the spreadsheet across the table. The president picks it up. His face goes pale. I explain that the spreadsheet shows payments from the HOA to a snow removal contractor owned by Betty's brother-in-law. The payments total $47,000 over 2 winters. The contract was never put out for competitive bid. The invoices show charges for emergency services that were never performed. I point to 3 line items that match dates when Betty cited me for violations. I said the violations were fabricated to justify emergency service charges that went to a vendor with a family connection to Betty. I say that is fraud. The room is silent. Betty is gripping the scraper so hard her knuckles are white. The treasurer is staring at the spreadsheet. The president is sweating. Carl is grinning in the back row. Betty stands up and says the meeting is over. I say the meeting is not over until I get a ruling. She bangs the gavel and says the board will issue a written decision within 10 business days. I say I want a decision now. She says that is not how this works. I say, you can be mad or you can be compliant. Her face goes purple. She tries to interrupt, but the president holds up his hand. He says the board needs to review the evidence in executive session. He says the hearing is adjourned. Betty storms out. The treasurer follows her. The president stays behind and tells me privately that he had no idea about the vendor payments. He says the board will investigate. I tell him I already filed a complaint with the management company, and if the board does not act, I will file a complaint with the state attorney general. He nods and leaves. Carl claps me on the shoulder. He says that was beautiful. I say I hope it was enough. 2 days later, I get a call from the management company. The rep says they received my complaint and launched an audit. She says the audit found irregularities in the winter enforcement program, including unapproved vendor contracts and missing documentation for several violation notices. She says the management company is recommending the board void all penalties issued under the Winter Safety Committee and agree to mediation with a neutral third party. She says Betty Lewis has been removed from the Welcome Committee and is under review for potential removal from the board. She asks if I am willing to participate in mediation. I say yes. The mediation happens 3 weeks later. The mediator is a retired judge. Betty is there with a lawyer. The board president and treasurer are there without Betty. The mediator reviews the evidence and says it is clear the violations were improperly issued and the enforcement process was flawed. He says the HOA must void all fines and penalties against me and issue a formal apology. He says the HOA must also refund any payments I made, which is zero because I refused to pay. He says the HOA must adopt new policies to prevent selective enforcement and require competitive bidding for all vendor contracts. He says Betty's conduct will be documented in the meeting minutes as a violation of fiduciary duty. Betty's lawyer tries to argue, but the mediator cuts him off. He says the evidence of the vendor kickback scheme is overwhelming, and if the board does not agree to his recommendations, he will refer the case to the state attorney general for criminal investigation. Betty does not say a word. The board president agrees to all the terms. The mediator drafts a settlement agreement on the spot. Everyone signs. I walk out with a voided violation record and a promise that Betty will never serve on an HOA committee again. 3 days after the mediation, I am in the driveway shoveling fresh snow when a car pulls up. It is my neighbor from across the street, a woman named Janet, who has lived here for 10 years. She gets out and says she heard what happened at the hearing. She says she is glad someone finally stood up to Betty. She says Betty tried to fine her last year for parking an RV in her driveway for 3 days during a family visit. Janet paid the fine because she did not think she could fight it. She asks if there is anything she can do to get the money back. I give her Carl's number and tell her to call him. She thanks me and says the neighborhood feels different now. Lighter. I tell her it is just snow. She laughs and says it is more than that. A week later, there is an HOA election. Betty does not run. A new board is elected. The new president is a retired teacher who promises transparency and fairness. At the first meeting, the new board votes to dissolve the Winter Safety Committee. They also vote to require all vendor contracts to go through a competitive bid process. They vote to create a homeowner complaint process with a neutral, third-party review. Carl attends the meeting and says it is the most functional HOA meeting he has ever seen. I do not go to the meeting. I am at home with my wife. She says she is proud of me for not backing down. I tell her I almost did. She says, but I did not, and that matters. We sit on the couch and watch the snow fall outside. It is quiet. No scrapers, no threats, just snow. The bent orange steak is still in the snowbank. I thought about removing it, but decided to leave it. It is a reminder, not of the fight, but of the fact that sometimes the rules are wrong, and someone has to say so. Spring comes. The snow melts. The steak straightens itself as the frost heaves settle. Betty moves out of the neighborhood. I hear through Carl that she sold her house and moved to Florida. No one misses her. The new board sends a newsletter apologizing for the previous administration's overreach and promising to do better. They include a line that says homeowners are encouraged to question enforcement actions and request documentation. I frame the newsletter and hang it in my garage next to my work gloves. One morning I am leaving for my shift when I see a new family moving in across the street. The husband is unloading a truck. The wife is directing the movers. A kid is running around in the snow with a dog. They look happy. I wave. The husband waves back. I think about walking over and telling them about the HOA fight, but I do not. They will figure it out if they need to. Or maybe they will not. Maybe the new board will keep its promises and this neighborhood will be the quiet place I thought it was when I moved in. I drive to work. My supervisor asks how things are at home. I tell him quiet. He says that is good. I tell him it is. We load the salt spreaders and head out. The roads are clear. The sun is bright. It is just another day, and for the first time in months that feels like enough. But the story is not over. Not really. Because 2 months later I get a letter in the mail. It is from the State Attorney General's office. The letter says they are investigating allegations of financial misconduct at Summit Snowfield HOA Incorporated. They are requesting my cooperation as a witness. I call the number on the letter. The investigator says the management company audit found additional irregularities beyond the vendor kickback. They found evidence that Betty approved multiple emergency service contracts without board votes. They found invoices for work that was never done. They found payments to vendors that do not exist. The total amount is over $200,000. The investigator says they are building a fraud case, and they need my testimony about the tow authorization and the fake violations. I agree to cooperate. The case takes a year. I give a deposition. I testify at a hearing. I provide copies of all my records. Carl and Donna testify too. Janet testifies. 3 other homeowners who were targeted by Betty testify. The state investigator subpoenas the HOA bank records and finds transfers to shell companies. They trace the transfers to accounts controlled by Betty and her brother-in-law. The evidence is overwhelming. Betty is charged with fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of authority. Her brother-in-law is charged as an accomplice. They both plead guilty. Betty is sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution. Her brother-in-law gets probation and a fine. The HOA gets a new management company. The board implements financial controls and oversight. The neighborhood starts to feel like a community instead of a surveillance state. I am shoveling my driveway one morning when Carl walks over. He says he heard Betty tried to appeal her sentence. I ask what happened. He says the appeal was denied. He says the judge cited her repeated abuse of power and lack of remorse. He says she will serve the full 3 years. I do not feel good about it. I do not feel bad either. I feel like justice happened, which is rare enough that it is worth noticing. Carl asks if I am going to the next HOA meeting. I tell him probably not. He says I should. He says the board is voting on a proposal to rename the Winter Safety Committee the Homeowner Advocacy Committee. He says it was Janet's idea. I tell him that is a good idea. He says it is. He says maybe I should run for the board. I laugh and tell him I have enough on my plate. He says think about it. I tell him I will. That night my wife asks if I regret moving here. I tell her no. She asks if I would do it again. I tell her yes. She asks why. I tell her because walking away would have meant letting Betty win, and I could not do that. Not for me, but for everyone who came after me. She says that is a good reason. I say it is the only reason. We sit on the porch and watch the sunset. The neighborhood is quiet. Kids are playing in the street. Someone is grilling. A dog is barking. It is normal. It is boring. It is exactly what I wanted when I moved here. And it only happened because I refused to be compliant. Betty used to say, you can be mad, or you can be compliant. She said it like those were the only choices. She was wrong. You can be mad and still win. You can fight back and still be smart. You can stand up without breaking the rules. That is what I learned. That is what I want people to know. A year later I am at the grocery store when I see the board president from the old regime. The man who sat next to Betty at the hearing. He is pushing a cart full of frozen dinners. He sees me and freezes. I nod. He nods back. We do not speak. There is nothing to say. He was there. He let it happen. He did not stop her. Maybe he did not know. Maybe he did not care. Either way, he is gone now, and someone better is in his place. That is enough. I run into Carl at the hardware store. He is buying rock salt for the winter. He says the new board is doing quarterly audits now. He says every vendor contract gets reviewed by an independent accountant. He says the newsletter goes out on time and includes meeting agendas and budget summaries. He says it is boring and functional and exactly what an HOA should be. I tell him that is good. He says it is. He says none of it would have happened if I had just paid the first fine. I tell him I got lucky. He says it was not luck, it was stubbornness. I laugh and tell him maybe both. He says probably. The next winter is quiet. The snow falls. The plows run. The stakes stay in the ground. No one gets fined. No one gets towed. No one shows up with a scraper and a threat. It is boring. I love it. I am clearing my driveway one morning when a man pulls up in a truck. He gets out and introduces himself. He says he just bought a house 2 streets over. He says he heard about what happened with Betty and the HOA. He says he wanted to thank me. I ask why. He says because he almost did not buy in this neighborhood because of the HOA reputation. He says a friend told him things changed and it was safe now. He says he did his research and saw the new board and the new policies. He says he felt confident enough to make an offer. I tell him I am glad it worked out. He says his family is too. He shakes my hand and leaves. I stand in my driveway and watch him drive away. I think about Betty and the scraper and the bent stake. I think about the hearing and the mediator and the settlement. I think about the letter from the Attorney General and the testimony and the guilty plea. I think about all the hours I spent fighting something that should never have happened in the first place. And I think about this man who I have never met, who bought a house in a neighborhood he almost avoided, because someone fought back and won. That is the point. That is why it mattered. Not because I got my fines voided, not because Betty went to prison, but because the next person does not have to go through what I went through. The system is better now. Not perfect, but better. And better is enough. I go inside and pour coffee. My wife is at the table reading the HOA newsletter. She says the new board is planning a spring cleanup day. She asks if we should volunteer. I tell her sure. She says it is funny how normal it is now. I tell her that is the whole point. She says she knows. She says she is glad we stayed. I tell her me too. The coffee is hot. The house is warm. The snow is falling outside, but it does not feel like a threat anymore. It is just snow. Just winter. Just weather. I spent 6 months fighting an HOA that treated me like an enemy. I spent a year helping the state build a case against a woman who stole from her neighbors. I spent 2 years waiting for things to feel normal again. And now they do. Not because the problems went away, but because the systems changed, because people held the powerful accountable. Because someone said no when it would have been easier to say yes. I finish my coffee and look out the window. The bent orange stake is still there, half buried in the snow. I could pull it out. I could fix it. I could call the city and have them replace it. But I do not. I leave it where it is. A reminder. A monument. A middle finger to anyone who thinks they can bully people into compliance. Spring will come. The snow will melt. The stake will straighten. And life will go on. But I will remember. And the next time someone tells me I can be mad or I can be compliant, I will tell them there is a third option. I can be right. And I can fight. And I can win. 5 years later, I am still here. The HOA is boring. The board turns over every 2 years. The policies hold. The audits happen. The vendor contracts are competitive. The violations are fair. The appeals are heard. It is not perfect, but it works. And that is the best you can hope for. I see Janet sometimes. She is on the board now. She says she ran because someone had to keep an eye on things. I tell her that is a good reason. She says it is. She says the board is thinking about creating a homeowner education program to teach people their rights under the covenants. She asks if I would be willing to speak at the first session. I tell her I will think about it. She says that is good enough. Carl moved away. He got a job in Lansing and bought a house near the capital. We text sometimes. He sends me articles about HOA reform legislation. I send him pictures of my quiet, boring driveway. He says I won. I say I survived. He says same thing. I say maybe. Donna still fights abusive HOAs. She says my case helped her win 3 more. She says the precedent we set made it easier to argue selective enforcement. She says the state is paying attention now. She says that matters. I believe her. Betty got out of prison last year. I do not know where she is. I do not care. She is someone else's problem now. Or maybe she learned. I doubt it, but stranger things have happened. The stake is gone. The city replaced it 3 years ago. The new one is straight and tall and bright orange. It stands in the easement like a flag. Every time I see it, I think about that morning when Betty showed up with her scraper and her threats. I think about how scared I was. I think about how close I came to just paying and walking away. And I think about how glad I am that I did not. Because if I had paid, Betty would still be stealing. The board would still be ignoring it. The next homeowner would still be getting fined for fake violations. And the neighborhood would still be a place where normal life becomes an enforcement opportunity. Instead, it is a place where people shovel their driveways and wave to their neighbors and argue about where to put the speed bumps. It is boring. It is normal. It is good. Last week I was at a city council meeting for work. A woman stood up during public comment and said her HOA was fining her for having a vegetable garden in her front yard. She said the covenants say only ornamental plants are allowed. She said she cannot afford to fight it. She asked the council if there was anything they could do. The council said they have no jurisdiction over HOA covenants. The woman sat down. She looked defeated. I walked up to her after the meeting. I gave her Carl's number. I gave her Donna's number. I told her about my case. I told her she could fight and win. She asked if it was worth it. I told her that depends on what she is willing to lose. She said she did not know. I told her to call the numbers and decide. She thanked me. I do not know if she called. I hope she did. That is the thing about fighting an HOA. You do not just fight for yourself. You fight for everyone who comes after. You set the precedent. You create the paper trail. You force the systems to change. And maybe, if you are lucky, the next person has an easier time because you made it harder for the bullies to win. I do not think about Betty much anymore. I do not think about the hearing or the mediator or the settlement. I do not think about the vendor payments or the fake violations or the tow authorization. Those things happened. They are part of the story, but they are not the whole story. The whole story is what came after. The quiet, the boring, the normal. The neighborhood that works because someone made it work. I am in my driveway. The sun is setting. The air is warm. The snow is a memory. My wife is inside making dinner. My neighbors are outside talking. A kid is riding a bike. A dog is barking. It is just another evening in Summit Snowfield. And that is exactly what it should be. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.